This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond, plus interviews with European policymakers and analysts. I'm William Glucroft, a journalist who writes the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
I'm Martin Gack, writing inconclusive thoughts from Berlin on international politics, social issues, and things of the kind.
We're recording on Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. Things may have changed by the time you hear this podcast, but we'll be talking about everybody's favorite thing around Europe and beyond. That's, of course, Eurovision. Changes to law making things a little bit less European-friendly in Georgia. Of course, we're going to have the latest on rulings about the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and some surprise election results in Spain, plus some great interviews with Hugo Ortiz-Dubon, former ambassador from El Salvador to the European Union, and friend of the show, Andrew Rettman, talking to us more about Eurovision. All right, let's get on with the show because we have a lot to talk about.
So, William Glucroft, what do we have for this week?
Dr. Martin, well, we're talking Eurovision, like everybody has been wrapping up the last few days since Eurovision happened between our last episode and this episode, and I'm proud and or ashamed to admit that I did watch it, but for professional reasons only, of course. And it was...
I have not this year. I never have, even though for some reason I became interested in Eurovision.
Yeah, well, I think we'll cover that more in the interview later, so we're not going to talk about too much of it now, but just to say, before we get to the politics of it, I just thought it was boring. I've watched a couple times under duress, I should say, for a few years now, and I just find it, I welcome the camp and I welcome the silliness, but I don't find it campy or silly. Well, it's definitely campy, but I just find it boring and untalented and all rather quite derivative. I just feel like I'm watching ChatGPT feed me up, versions of Taylor Swift.
I don't know anything about Taylor Swift. I am proud to say that I have not heard, nor can I identify, even if I have heard any songs. I did try about, once or twice to listen to Just Klein, who was billed as the sort of the great promise of this Eurovision. And I will admit that I got 15 to 20 seconds of it. I could not go beyond that. There was a chicken dancing on stage, and then there was this guy with a very strange haircut and huge shoulder pads, and the noise was absolutely unbearable. He was shouting "Europapa" something or other. But anyway, I mean, it turned out that
lucky you though, Martin, because he got kicked out of the tournament anyway before he even having a chance to get on stage. So good for you. You didn't even have to listen to it, even if you did watch it.
Even with all the silliness, I would say that it is remarkable how politically relevant this became, and that, of course, we're gonna be discussing with Andrew Rettman. So, what are the big stories?
Well, Martin, I wanted to turn to you because you follow Spanish politics more closely than me. I mean, it was quite a bombshell election result not too long ago. So maybe you can give us a quick wrap of what exactly happened and what it means.
Well, Catalonia went to the polls, and it turns out that the nationalists, the independentists, came in a second place, 35% or so, to the great surprise of essentially the socialists coming on first position. So essentially the change in numbers is not huge, but what is actually very relevant is that for the first time in a very long time, the independentists no longer control the parliament. And this is a very big deal because it shows actually that there has been a fairly serious shift. It might have to do with the fact that Madrid has gone closer to the political intuitions of the Catalonian population. It might also have to do with the fact that, the shenanigans and basically the fiasco of the Catalonian independentist elections that sent eventually Puigdemont to Brussels and produce basically riots in the streets of Barcelona, is slowly fading from view in the rearview mirror. But it is a pretty large change, pretty serious change, and I think it's also a huge boost for the Spanish government right now, which has found support in a place where very likely was not expected.
Yeah, I'm shocked. I mean, I first heard the news on German news, and I was sure that I just misunderstood the German, because I really was not expecting the socialists to win, especially given the recent news about Pedro Sanchez, and is he going to step down or not, and implications of corruption with his wife, and would he go to Brussels? There was all this mystery wrapped up in the fate and the future of the socialists, and specifically Pedro Sanchez.
Indeed. So on other news, we had von der Leyen building her campaign as, her campaign to stay at the very top of the European Commission on fighting disinformation and external influence, which made me think such a pity that she was not at the helm of the European Commission for the last few years and able to stop the undue external... Wait. Oh, yeah, she was.
Not remarkable. Very clever.
Thank you. It's kind of remarkable that after a period of 5 years, especially I would say not 5 years, but more like 10, in the aftermath of Brexit, where we had very, very strong indications, not to mention the American elections and so on, very strong indications of very pernicious external influence. We have now von der Leyen standing there talking about building, a political project for her next tenure on stopping the political influence she did not manage to curb during her, present tenure.
Yeah, it's a very German way of doing politics as we see at the national level. Just no one really taking responsibility, people not really acting or forgetting or seeming to not be aware that they're in power. They can actually help set policy as if there's just kind of think tankers looking from the outside, which, not to dump too much only on the Germans, is also a little bit of the way Emmanuel Macron seems to govern, where he makes these big flourishing speeches as if he's some kind of outside analyst and not the president of France.
It's really lovely to see political systems in which the opposition tries by all means to be government, and when they finally get to be government, they realize that there is nothing they miss as much as being opposition and being able to stand like, old men in the park shouting at the clouds. But, there you have it. I mean, it's just sort of, it also, I think that it not only shows the shortcomings of the Commission, once again, it shows the very problem with a lot of the Euro bubble machine, which is that they are ineffective at doing the basic groundwork for their jobs, and then they go out campaigning on what they will do if they're allowed to actually just continue for a few more years not doing their jobs.
Right. Of course, when you're in the opposition, you can blame yourself being in the opposition, and when you're in power, you can blame the opposition for blocking you. So there's always a way to kind of skirt responsibility.
Also that. So what about you? I mean, I know you've been looking at German things.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly what you say about the opposition. I mean, this is why the far right, not only in Germany but elsewhere, have such salience among many voting populations and many voting constituencies, because they've never had to actually govern, right? They've never had to prove themselves in most cases what they would actually do in government. This is sort of, some of the more optimists among us say this is kind of a saving grace of European liberal systems, that even if the far right did get into power, it'd be such a mess. They would be so disorganized that they'd quickly fall out of power or not really be able to implement any of their worst nightmares, or, I guess, finest fantasies, depending on how you're looking at it. Of course, when it comes to the far right, if they were in power, just being disorganized and chaotic could be enough to ruin things for the rest of us, so to speak. But to that point, we had two big stories revolving the far right in Germany this week. One is that the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which until recently was giving mainstream politics a run for its money at the state and federal level and at the European level, they lost their case to get this designation of being an extremist organization thrown out. They lost it. So the domestic intelligence of Germany can actually classify the AfD and members of it as far-right extremist parties by the definition of as Germany defines that, which is that they're anti-democratic. They go against the democratic order. They go against Germany's constitution, which is not really a constitution, but that's a whole other story. And the AfD has been fighting this in courts to try to say that, this is nonsense. We're not extremists, but the court sided with domestic intelligence and those kinds of authorities. So that basically makes the AfD an extremist movement, running for power at the state level and elsewhere.
I think the reason why this has a very strong echo through the European political landscape is because many of these far-right parties, associations, and outfits, which are actually almost directly associated with the darkest past of Europe, have done sort of really enormous efforts to rebrand themselves as center-right. Not only they have looked for a home, for instance, in the European People's Party in Brussels, but, they have done everything they can to kind of cleanse themselves from their Nazis and fascist past. And, you have Giorgia Meloni, who until, only a few years ago, she was actually still promoting the figure of Giorgio Almirante, her political father, who was not only a fascist, but somebody that belonged to sort of the most sort of radical anti-Semitic part of the fascist party. And he became the founder or the grandfather of the post-war essentially fascist party, which was the Movimento Sociale Italiano. The same thing goes for Le Pen, whose father was the founder of the FEN. The same thing goes for a lot of the figures in the AfD, especially in central Germany, in Turin, who had shown sort of very strong sympathies to Nazism. Wilders. I mean, all of a sudden, these parties and these groups are actually trying very hard to sort of name themselves or be named something other than far-right. And I think that what is interesting about this is that it at least gives, essentially latches the AfD onto the extremist and far-right tag and probably forecloses them from doing that.
Right. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a fascist, right? I mean, that's the one thing. The other big news out of Germany, far right circles this week, is that Björn Höcke, the leader or the co-leader of the AfD in the state of Thuringia, easily one of the most extremist voices in the entire AfD, which is itself, as we've just discussed, an extremist party, was found guilty of using Nazi speech, of using banned speech. In Germany. Now, that's a whole other debate if speech should be banned, and that's a different discussion. But in Germany, Björn Höcke used Alles für Deutschland, everything for Germany, in a speech a few years ago, which does have associations to the Nazi era. He claimed he had no idea that had any kind of historical implications, but the court did not find that very believable, and they found him guilty. And it was a financial fine. He won't serve any jail time. He could still run in politics. But it is at least a statement that you can't get away with just anything, and you can't claim ignorance. And so Björn Höcke, at least on the record, is guilty of sort of propagating Nazi slogans.
I think that if it is true that he did not know that this was actually a statement associated with the essay, he should at least be made to pay a fine for dereliction of duties as a history teacher, which is what he was. So, one way or another, he doesn't get off the hook. We did talk about this outside of cameras, they like to say on television, and your judgment is that this was indeed fairly appropriate as a punishment.
Yeah, there's, of course, this desire to, kick him out of politics, throw him in jail. He's a threat to society, a threat to democracy. And there's a case for that. Björn Höcke is not a pleasant individual. But if he was given something more serious, a punishment that didn't fit the crime, a punishment that looked beyond just the crime, beyond just what he said, and looked at the bigger picture, that in itself would be a kind of authoritarian response, right? To kind of get rid of political opponents. And it would feed into this far-right narrative that they're somehow victims to some kind of grand deep state plot against them. You see this in the United States, where Donald Trump says they're trying to get rid of me and get me off the ballot. This is what all these court cases are for. So I think the ruling was appropriate.
I think not only you don't want to produce a martyr for the cause, but you probably do not want to give Hoka the opportunity of writing his political biography in jail. Those things usually don't go very well here, right?
Yeah, although maybe if you said that to Herke, he would have no idea what you were talking about.
Good, because that would actually probably spare us from a lawsuit or something like that. Anyhow,
right.
So those are my big stories, the things I've been looking at. There is a lot more where these things came from. I was this week actually worth mentioning, following Peter Magyar in Eastern Hungary, watching the anti-Orban try his hand at building a right-wing party. Sort of outside of the Orban tent, which is Fidesz.
The Orban orbit.
The anti-Orban Orban. And it's really quite remarkable because one of the things that I think I mention in passing perhaps in conversation is that one of the things you see when you're very far out in the field, and this was really sort of smack against the border with Ukraine that I was hanging out, there is nobody talking for Europe. I mean, Europe is talked about, but Europe cannot answer and cannot defend itself. And you're sort of sitting down in, political spaces where the conversation is not only in Hungarian, but it's a conversation among insiders. And Europe has no place there and has found, in all of these years, no way to participate in that conversation. I discussed this last week with Andrew Wilkins, who was on our show last week. But this, to me, remains sort of an incredible fact about the state of communications and about the state of the public sphere and discussion in Europe.
Yeah, so I don't mean to insult you, Martin, but you're channeling a lot of Henry Kissinger here when he was famous for saying, "Who do I call when I want to call Europe?"
Yes, to some degree, it's true. I am asking about sort of what is a centralized language or a centralized communication. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking it the other way around, because if you were to ask me, and you didn't, but I will answer the question you didn't ask anyway, is that the problem seems to be that, Europe has not figured out the fact that Europe does not speak politicos English and has not figured out the way to, talk in Hungarian, speak in Pugliese, speak in sort of Italian dialect and Spanish from Andalusia. So anyhow, this was just a little vignette of my travels this last week. So with that, I suggest we move to the next interview, which will be with Hugo Ortiz Bon, who was former ambassador of El Salvador to the European Union and is now with the Brussels Time, where he has developed a project of soft diplomacy and media, which just attracts mostly ambassadors and brings them together to have informal discussions on things that matter to Europeans, but also beyond the European sphere. So that is right ahead. Hugo Ortiz Bon, thank you for being with us at Euroscopic from the Brussels Times. So can you actually tell us a bit about what you're doing about the Brussels Times? Because we have you here to talk a bit about that, European public sphere and the state of media.
Of course, Martin. So with the Brussels Times, we just launched this initiative.
The initiative is a collaboration between the Brussels Times and the Bellevue Museum.
That is it's called the Ambassador Insider Series. And it's actually a platform where we invite the ambassadors of the international community to attend different sessions that is based on different interesting thematics and themes that are of relevance, hot topic in the Brussels political arena. And we have a 20-spot ambassador level participation, and we also invite, of course, interesting decision makers, perspective to bring on, and to also deep a little bit more into the topic and engage in interesting conversation, dialogue, when we have these sessions.
So you yourself come from a diplomatic background. I mean, this sounds very much like a project on soft diplomacy. But the thing that is quite interesting about it, and perhaps you can talk a bit about it, is the fact that it's actually built in the context of media.
Of course. And that's because, who better to be like a neutral ground to talk about different interesting topics that is going on in Brussels than a media outlet. And that's also the idea to engage into different topics and, to create a space where you can have this kind of off-the-record dialogue, but also the Brussels Times sometimes writes about the different topics, and then you can also get those interesting perspectives and interviews based on this platform as well.
Hugo, so then based on everything you just said, what's your audience? What are you hoping to achieve?
What we hope to achieve is to create a space in the Brussels political arena where we can put interesting decision makers from the Brussels political arena and also ambassadors to have a better scope and to understand how to navigate Brussels in different specific topics. Because today, we have a lot of events. Brussels is very known for a lot of events, and a lot of media outlets has a lot of interesting events based on topics, but it's also based on panels, it's based on half days. It's taking a lot of the times from, the decision makers. So what we want to create in a very easy model and setting is to put everyone into a room, talk about the topic, and also let them have the networking session in a more safe space.
So on that note, as Martin alluded to, you come from a background of diplomacy. Drawing on that experience, what from that experience sort of encouraged you or inspired you to pursue this initiative now?
It's actually very interesting because I got the idea the day I decided to step out of my previous position. I just there's something missing here in Brussels, especially for ambassadors, because all the many events are very interesting. And of course, it's based on thematics, but I was missing a place where I can actually talk to the one who is behind the decision-making process or have a better understanding on the topic. And sometimes when you have a very hectic back-to-back schedule in Brussels, you don't actually have the time to bring in those meetings in your everyday, life. So to create a space where it's, of course, directed to the international community, ambassadors in this case, and also bring those interesting perspective to that space, I think that what was missing here in Brussels. And it doesn't need to be complicated. The conversation that we had in the last 3 sessions has been very respectful. You put the guidelines, you put the tone, but also what I've also discovered is that many of the participants has expressed that they have gotten a new perspective on the thematic, on the topic. They have another take on the information that they got from these sessions as well.
Well, as most of the people that are probably listening to us are not part of diplomatic courses, the question is, what is in it for them? So why is this interesting? I mean, in terms of, media, what is this doing, you think, that actually contributes to sort of the general landscape of European, not only diplomatic questions, but really, public sphere?
I think it's bringing an opportunity to innovate diplomacy, but also to innovate policymaking, because the topics that we attend is also a lot of the topics that is going to influence third regions. And, there is a lot of interesting initiatives from the EU regarding the Green Deal, the Digital Alliance, the AI Act, different other, regulations and policies that is right now affecting the third regions, and also Europe's positioning in different regions around the world. I think this is a very good space attend and to address those topics, but in a different way. So I think there is something in there for everyone, and especially the decision makers, because they don't have this network. It's very kind of complicated to navigate, Brussels from different kind of ends, And what we are doing, we are calling it the Ambassador Insider Series because it's for the diplomatic community. But of course, there is also an opportunity for decision makers to contact us, and also to say if there is an interesting topic I would like to be considering to be a speaker or participating. And not only, decision makers, we are trying to also innovate in the way that bring in some perspective density into it, different other perspective from civil society, from other actors that are involved in the specific topics to also contribute with their perspective.
Hugo, I like that. That's a good segue to the thing that we can't ignore, right? European elections coming up in just a couple of weeks. From your vantage point, in this sort of Brussels bubble, talking to ambassadors, talking to decision makers, how does the bigger picture of European elections, of European citizens voting for many of these decision makers you're talking about, or people they work with, how does that look to you?
I think it's very important for the voters to understand that Europe is, and the EU and the European Parliament, it's not only of creating policy and legislation in Brussels for Europe, but also being an actor in the global, spectrum. And also those legislations and policies that are being created in Brussels gonna impact on the opportunity for Europe to grow in terms of, trade, in terms of partnership with other regions. So I think it's important for them to also see the outside perspective and how that influence who you vote for. Because there are many of the different groups in the parliament that are for trade, others are not. And, that's something that you need to take in consideration. Europe alone cannot create growth. You need to be interconnected with other regions around the world.
Do you think, and this will be, I promise, my last question, do you think that, given the fact that we are in the middle of so many conflicts, every day you wake up and it seems that there is a new, do you see this kind of public diplomacy, soft diplomacy projects having an impact on conflict resolution here at the heart of Europe?
I think it's important, no matter what the cause is right now, I think it's important to see, are the initiatives that are trying to create this partnership with other regions the right ones? We have the Global Gateway, who's want to be participating in be part of creating the infrastructure, digital infrastructure in other regions. Is that important for Europe, and do the Europeans want to be part of those kind of initiative? I think it's also what the voters need to define, if that is the right aspect to vote for someone, and who is doing it as well.
So Hugo Ortiz Dubon, former ambassador of Salvador to the European Union, thank you for being with us. Okay, so the images from Georgia this last week had been quite unsettling. Sort of a lot of violence in front of the parliamentary building, people getting beaten up by hooligans and thugs, mostly wearing police uniforms, but really remarkable images, things that I don't really remember seeing in quite a while. This actually is emerging from what is called a law on foreign influence, which basically penalizes political parties, media, and NGOs, mostly, that receive foreign funding as foreign agents or agents of foreign interest. This law actually repeats very much the game plan of Putin, and we have seen this kind of thing also pop up in Hungary. They used to call it the anti-Soros law. And it seems to continue to move through this sort of political sphere, right?
Indeed, and we also saw this in Poland, or an effort to do this in Poland. But in that case, and the reason it wasn't successful in Poland is that it was targeting a US-backed broadcaster. And when you got the US involved, then they made sure that that law didn't pass. Now, I find that very interesting because it shows, even in the European Union's own backyard, how little political influence it actually has, right? Poland can try to pass a kind of a media influence law or a foreign agent law. And if it affects the US gets involved and says, no, thank you, you're not going to do that, or we have all these tools in our toolbox to penalize you.
I think
now in Georgia's trying that. And even though you'd think the EU has leverage over Georgia because Georgia's trying to become part of the European Union, it still is able to pass this law. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Hungary, that's in the European Union, also is able to kind of control its media. It really leaves you to wonder, what is the enforcement mechanisms and the power that Brussels wields over the bloc?
I think it's very fair to say that Brussels is not Washington, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've heard this about Berlin before, but I think it applies equally to Brussels. People wake up in Brussels or Berlin or wherever wondering what people in Washington are thinking. But people in Washington, I don't really think, are waking up and desperately wondering what people in Brussels are thinking.
No, I think that the question of enforcement, though, is really quite central because, clearly it doesn't work at all within the European Union sphere. So, you have the issue of Hungary, you had the issue of Poland, you had sort of several different operators within the European Union that were really stepping not only out of line with European policy, but were quite simply defying the very principles of rules. And that Brussels was essentially incapable of doing anything, much less when you move one or two spheres farther out, right? And now you come into what is quite literally the Russian sphere of influence.
Right. So we have so much more on that. And of course, Eurovision right after this with friend of the show and EU Observer reporter Andrew Rettman. You've heard him before, and you're going to hear from him right after this.
Andrew Rettman, the man himself, he's back with us. Good to see you again.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me back.
So I have to confess to you, there is one main reason why I looked for you this week to come hang out with us. That's because you wrote an article on Eurovision. And I'm trying to figure out, maybe you can help me, how is it that all of a sudden, after 20 years of living in Europe, I suddenly care about Eurovision? What has happened that has made me care about Eurovision? I think that if there is anybody that can answer that question, it's you.
Well, I don't know you that well, Martin. So I'm not sure what your personal journey was like. But this was quite a special Eurovision, right? Because it had politics written all over it, despite it meant to be an apolitical kind of camp pop song event. We had the huge controversy of whether Israel should take part or not, whether protests should be allowed or not. Then we had the usual thing of Russia using it in its propaganda to say that Europe is gay and decadent and has lost its moral compass. And then finally, we had the surprise bonus of the EU flag controversy, with the European Commission throwing kind of a tantrum that its flag was not allowed. So there was lots of politics in it. The music was bloody awful as always, though there was probably more flesh on show than in past events. But I think somehow this captured people's attention in a funny way, more so than the European elections might in June. I think. I wonder if what the turnout will be like in that vote. I wish it had as much attention as the Eurovision finals did this year.
I will say that I got a lot of shoulder pads, massive shoulder pads. And the question that I had for a while was, maybe we should get all the Spitzenkandidaten in big shoulder pads and very funny hairs. Yeah, quite clearly it was very political. And it wasn't only very political, it also kind of blew up, right? There were like a lot of, not just controversies, but there were actually fairly serious altercations around the political issues.
Well, I was following a bit the nature of the protests in Sweden. And I think, there was a lot of complaints from Israel about a wave of ugly anti-Semitism against its singer, Ms. Golan. But actually, when you spoke to the Swedish police, as of the morning of Saturday, there was only one anti-Semitic incident which they had recorded, and that was something someone had posted on social media. So it wasn't a physical attack, for instance, or verbal aggression. And in fact, the pro-Palestinian protests outside the venue appear to have been carefully organized, well-behaved, and well-policed. And actually, it's quite a serious issue in a way, because the rest of the world was looking at Eurovision as well. And I think they needed to see that these protests were allowed. Otherwise, it would have just seemed weird to have Israel there with no comment on the Gaza war. So the protesters provided that comment. They provided it quite peacefully, I thought.
Yeah, I think if all this went ahead as a glitzy show, we'd be treading into Russian territory, where it's like nothing to see here, nothing to see, the man behind the curtain. You mentioned, the apolitical nature of it, but I think everyone knows that Eurovision is actually very political. And yet we see this discrepancy with kicking Russia out, but keeping Israel in. How does the level of politics this year compare to past Eurovisions, would you say?
Well, last year I wrote an article about how Russian propaganda was attacking it. So people were always bringing in politics from the outside. Obviously, the year before that, Russia itself was banned, which was, as you say, a highly political decision. Previously, the politics tended to revolve around which countries vote for which of their friends, who votes for Serbia in the Western Balkans and who doesn't. Does Central and Eastern Europe stick together? But it was kind of politics light. And I think that, we always had the politics of the LGBTI movement. That was always part of it. So when we had transgender singer Conchita Wurst winning back in the day, that was taken up by Israel as a statement about the pluralism and democracy of its society. Politics was always smuggled in from the outside. There was always the LGBTI politics, but I think it became kind of geopolitical when the Russia war exploded. And it's interesting as well about the EU flag, because the EU has said it wants to be a geopolitical entity. It's creating this whole new defense spending, arms fund for Ukraine. But now it's claiming that its flag is apolitical. So there's a lot of ambiguity around it. But I think it was the Russia war and now the Gaza war that brought real politics into the game.
It's really quite interesting, because one of the things I actually was reading a couple of days ago was that, in fact, the only flags that were allowed were the flags of countries that were competing.
Yeah. And
the gay flag and the rainbow flag, which basically, puts it obviously in direct collision course, the possible wave of far-right politics in Europe, including, not just Orban, as it used to be, but also now Italy and the right wing of France and so on, which have taken the question of gay rights into the discussion. So, it seems that, in a way, allowing the rainbow flag in is a very strong political statement. I cannot for the life of me believe that anybody in the EBU, which actually organizes this machine, the European Broadcasting Union, would not be aware of the fact that, flanging not only the rainbow flag, but actually turning into an event which has a very strong, let's say, pride parade aesthetic, would not be essentially hurling the entire thing into a political discussion.
I think they should embrace it. I think they should allow all kinds of flags and protests, so long as the hate speech laws or whatever kind of free speech laws of the host country are honored. I think they should embrace that. It's one of the rare occasions where show business and its kind of high level production values and young people and all meet European politics, and it's an opportunity to discuss these things. I don't see why they're running away from it. I really don't.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, as you were alluding to earlier, if maybe we could somehow tie the Eurovision voting with the European elections voting, maybe even create a reality TV show for MEPs. Maybe that would attract more people to vote.
Yeah, it sounds like a joke, but it's a pity in a way that we can't get the same level of attention for serious politics as we can for the more, let's say, well, it's not exactly whimsical, but it's still sort of toned down political clashes of the Eurovision Song Contest. The same ones are writ large and more serious and more aggressive in the European elections. I wish that we could somehow bring a little bit of that show business pizzazz and youthful interest to the European vote. I wonder how that could be done without cheapening it.
This sounds like a job for some highly paid consultant. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer. Let's broaden this. Are you volunteering, Martin?
I will volunteer for enough. So if it's highly paid enough, I mean, I certainly would volunteer.
I think Andrew's footing the bill, so it's sky's the limit.
Absolutely. We got to look for the
Let's broaden this out a little bit. You were also writing about Georgia and this foreign agents bill. Georgia is a participant, is part of the Eurovision, wants to be part of the European Union. These things are clashing. Maybe we can make a little bit of a jump into that. You could tell us a little bit more about what that's all about.
Well, it seems to be about Bidzina Ivanishvili, this shady Georgian billionaire who's the honorary chairman of the Georgian Dream Party. And it seems to be about his U-turn away from Western integration towards the Russian world, where he made his fortune. And it's a dangerous political gamble for him, because I think that the level of European support in Georgia is still well above 80%. And they're heading to elections in September, October, so he could be punished for this. But he's certainly a curious character. He reminds me a little bit of Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland, you know, this eminence grise who stands outside and behind the national political scene. I once interviewed him. It was about 10, 12 years ago when he was Prime Minister of Georgia briefly. And at the time, they were really passing pro-European legislation, for instance, bringing us back to Eurovision for a second on LGBTI, let's say, liberties and protections in Georgian society. But when I met him, he made a very weird impression on me. You know, I met him in his summer residence near the Black Sea. And not only was I greeted by an impressive security entourage at the gate, but then I had a ride on his private monorail through his complex, past his menagerie, to his...
That was pretty awesome, I got to say. Politics aside, having a private monorail is kind of a dream of mine.
Well, yes, if we had leaders like that competing in the European elections, that would be very entertaining. He wasn't that entertaining when I met him, though. His eyes are very close together, which is disconcerting. But he also just has this kind of strange, kind of messianic glow about him, you know? As though he thinks he knows everything about everything just because he's rich. But I think he's really...
So he's Elon Musk. So he's like the Georgian Elon Musk?
The Georgian Elon Musk, exactly. That's a very good comparison. And so I'm hoping that he's basically just blown up his own political base here with this swerve toward Russia. And, you know, it may be the case that he thinks he's trying to save Georgia from some geopolitical clash, but you can't... I still don't think one man, no matter how rich or powerful, can drag a whole country by the nose in the opposite direction it wants to go to. And when you talk about the values of Eurovision, well, certainly, or the values of the European Union, there's a big crossover. And, you know, free speech is, at least should be one of them. Eurovision has done, it didn't exactly ban free speech by banning protests, but maybe there's a lesson for Eurovision from Georgia that people want political, verbal, intellectual freedom, even freedom to shock and upset each other. But this is why they're joining the EU, for freedom.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that we are about to see a Georgian Euromaidan, given the sort of the sheer violence that has been exercised on many of these demonstrators? I mean, do you think that this is bound to escalate into a full geopolitical or geostrategic situation?
Well, I don't think that all those protesters are going to go away just because the law's been passed on Tuesday, yesterday. And I'm not sure when the president is due to sign it into law. It should be in the coming days normally, and she will refuse. And then there'll be another parliamentary vote to overrule that which could be another big flashpoint in terms of violence. Now, of course, you've got Russia occupying 2 regions of Georgia, so its forces are already effectively stationed there. And I don't know. I mean, you could write a nightmare scenario in which there is a kind of Euromaidan, and Ivanishvili somehow first using interior forces, and then if the situation explodes, inviting maybe Russian forces to help him. I hope it doesn't go that way, obviously, but I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Still, though, this is the country in a way that started almost the color revolutions. I think the Rose Revolution was one of the first in the series, and I think that memory is deep in Georgian society. As I say, I think it'll get worse before it gets better. I just hope there's no serious violence before the political changeover. Maybe people will just last it out until the parliamentary elections and hope they can turn things around there. But the region itself is interesting as well. Obviously, Azerbaijan doesn't have much interest in joining the EU, but I think Armenia is now on a vector back towards the EU after abandoning its integration into the Russian the Eurasian Economic Forum. And while Armenia and Georgia have very different politics and history, they face the same threats and the same journey in terms of values towards a more liberal and free speech-oriented European setup.
Well, I think I could talk to Mr. Redman for hours. I find him incredibly eloquent and insightful on the topics that he covers for EU Observer. So hopefully we'll have him back again. But we have to bring this episode to a close. So as always, want to look ahead to what might be coming up. What's on your radar, Martin?
Well, I mean, so I think I should say that in my radar, still Gaza looms large. I think that, this is an absolute catastrophe that keeps evolving and keeps actually hitting political mechanisms of different sorts across Europe. I think that the latest casualty that we have seen slowly emerge is the question of freedom of speech. And we have, I think, discussed this to a large degree under the filed under Eurovision. So I think a lot of that discussion really had to do with the possibility of, the way I see what just happened in Eurovision is essentially, do we have the possibility of discussing or criticizing, more importantly, in the public sphere, the doings of Israel in Gaza? And I think that the answer to a large degree that we saw emerge from Eurovision is no. I think that the next battleground, which is already sort of hotly contested, is basically right now European campuses. We have seen encampments, like in the US, happening in several parts of Europe. But the other thing that we have also seen is massive and incredibly violent pushback by police forces. This has happened particularly brutally in Amsterdam, where the images were essentially of a street war, street battles. This also happened in Paris, and they repeated some of the things that we have seen in sort of broader protests in places like Berlin, where the police action has been absolutely inexcusable. The one shining light, I would say, in all of this disaster is Maastricht University. And basically, the city of Maastricht came to a deal with students and protesters, which came down to, okay, you want to sleep in the encampment, by all means do, just clean up after yourself and don't make too much of a mess. So what that meant was that the city of Maastricht spared itself all these images of absolutely useless and violent confrontations, which really have a direct impact on the way that we understand the possibility of, essentially the public sphere across Europe. What about you? What do you have coming up for this coming week?
Well, quite, very much in stark contrast to sort of efforts to curtail fundamental rights. We have in a few weeks European elections, which are supposed to embrace fundamental rights and everything that the European Union says it stands for. And what I think I'll be keeping an eye on, along with lots of concerned people, is will there be incidences of cyber attacks or really serious deep fakes, these kinds of things that we've seen in other elections and other risks to try to sway the election one way or another, outside influence. And if there's not, I kind of wonder if that means that foreign actors, whether it's China or Russia, just don't really take European elections very seriously, don't think there's really any need to invest resources in manipulating the European Parliament, at least in that way, especially since we've seen in this past legislative session, you could just do it the old-fashioned way with bags of cash.
I like the idea that we're darned if we get sort of foreign influence, but it really reflects pretty poorly on our elections if we don't.
That's it for this week's Euroscopic, written by us, produced by us, and edited by Martin. You can catch us every week either at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com, or on euobserver.com. We'd love to hear from you, so be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts. Thanks so much to Andrew Redman from the EU Observer and Hugo Ortiz Dubon coming to us from Brussels. Till next time, I'm William Glucroft.
And I am Martin Duck.
Thanks for listening.